If Israel was God's people, why does the Bible later speak of Israel and Judah as if they were two different kingdoms? Israel began as a family. Jacob, the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, received a new name from God, Israel. From his sons came the tribes. From those tribes came a people, and from that people came a kingdom. But after Solomon, that kingdom was torn apart. The northern tribes rejected the new government and formed a separate kingdom that kept the name Israel. Meanwhile, in the south, the kingdom of Judah remained, with Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. What happened? How did the people who came from the same promise end up divided into two kingdoms? Why did some tribes continue to be called Israel, while others became known as Judah? And why did Jerusalem, the city of David, the spiritual center of the nation, remain in Judah, while most of the tribes belonged to Israel? This was not just a political split, it was a spiritual wound, a leadership decision, a kingdom broken by pride, a hardened heart, and the fear of losing control. And today, we are going to walk through that story. Because this is the story of how God's people went from one family to one nation to one kingdom, and finally to two kingdoms standing against each other. A people born from the same promise, but divided by choices that would mark generations. Before Israel was divided into two kingdoms, it first had to become one. Because Israel did not begin as a nation with a palace, an army, a temple, and a king. It began as a family. Jacob, the man God named Israel, had sons, and from those sons came the tribes that would carry the name of his descendants. Over time, that family grew. They went down to Egypt. They were enslaved. They cried out to God, and God raised up Moses to bring them out with a mighty hand. But leaving Egypt did not mean they were already a kingdom. They were free, yes, but they were still on their way to the land God had promised them. After Moses, Joshua led the people into Canaan. There they conquered cities, took possession of territory, and the land was divided among the tribes. Each tribe received its inheritance, its place, its portion inside the promise. Judah in one region, Benjamin in another, Ephraim and Manasseh in others. And little by little, the people began to live in the land as a confederation of tribes. Then came the time of the judges, and during that season, Israel lived in repeated cycles of obedience and rebellion. When the people turned away from God, oppression came, chaos came, enemies rose against them. But when they cried out, God raised up judges to deliver them. Still, the book of Judges describes that time with one very powerful sentence: everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that is where the desire for a king began to grow. The people wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted a visible authority, a throne, an organized army, a leader who could guide them in war and represent them in politics. Then came Saul, the first king of Israel. After him came David, the king after God's own heart. David conquered Jerusalem and made it the capital. And after David came his son Solomon. Under Solomon's reign, Israel reached an astonishing level of glory, wealth, influence, the building of the temple, and recognition among the nations. For a season, the tribes lived under one crown: Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Reuben, and Simeon were all part of one people under one kingdom. That was the great united kingdom of Israel. But here is the tension. The fact that the kingdom was united did not mean everything was healthy beneath the surface. And when Solomon died, everything that looked united began to reveal its cracks. The question was no longer whether Israel had a king. The question was whether the next king would have enough wisdom to preserve what God had allowed to be built. And that is where the rupture begins. When Solomon died, his son inherited more than a throne. He inherited a tired people. He inherited built-up tension. He inherited a kingdom that looked glorious on the outside, but was fragile underneath. The new king was Rehoboam, and now he had an enormous responsibility before him, to keep together the people who had been raised under one crown. But the first great moment of his reign did not happen in Jerusalem. It happened in Shechem. And Shechem was not just any place. It was a city filled with memory for Israel, a place of history, a place of covenant, a place of identity, a place with deep spiritual weight. It was there that the new king had to be recognized by the people. So Rehoboam went to Shechem to be confirmed as king, but the people came with a request. They came asking for relief. They told the new king that his father had placed a heavy burden on them. The taxes were hard, the labor was heavy, and their request was simple. If you lighten this burden, we will serve you. Rehoboam had an open door in front of him. He could have begun his reign with wisdom instead of pressure. He could have shown the people that he understood something deeper, that leading God's people was not only about sitting on David's throne, it was about caring for the sheep God had placed under his responsibility. And at first Rehoboam did something that seemed right. He asked for time before giving an answer. First, he consulted the older men who had served his father Solomon. These men had seen the weight of the kingdom from the inside. They had seen the glory, but they had also seen the burden. They knew the people, they knew the throne, and they knew the consequences of a foolish decision. Their counsel was wise. In essence, they told him, if today you serve this people, if you listen to them, if you answer them with kindness, then they will serve you all their days. Because those elders understood something many leaders forget. Leadership that lasts is not built on authority alone. It is built on service. A king could force people to fear him for a season, but if he wanted to keep a nation united, he needed to earn their trust. Rehoboam heard that counsel. But then he went to the young men who had grown up with him, and they did not speak to him about service. They spoke to him about strength. They did not tell him to lighten the burden. They told him to make it heavier. They advised him to answer harshly, to show power, to make it clear from the very beginning that he would be even stronger than his father. And Rehoboam chose to listen to the wrong voice. When the people returned for his answer, the new king did not speak like a shepherd. He spoke like a man who was afraid to look weak. He told them that if his father had placed a heavy burden on them, he would make it even heavier. If Solomon had disciplined them with whips, he would discipline them with scorpions. And in that moment, Rehoboam's words were not just words, they were a rupture. He did not understand that the people did not need a threat. They needed to be heard. He did not understand that inheriting David's throne did not mean he had automatically inherited the heart of the people. He did not understand that a crown can be received by inheritance. But trust must be earned through wisdom. And when the northern tribes heard his answer, they understood something clearly. This new government was not going to lighten the burden. It was going to make it harder. So they spoke words that would mark history. What share do we have in David? What inheritance do we have in the son of Jesse? Those words were not just anger. They were separation. They were the sound of a people breaking away from the house of David. And in that moment, the kingdom that had been united under Saul, David, and Solomon began to split apart. The division did not begin with a sword. It began with an arrogant answer. Rehoboam had a chance to unite, but he chose to impose. He had a chance to listen, but he chose to threaten. He had a chance to serve, but he chose to prove his power. And just like that, the people who came from the same promise began to divide before his eyes. Because many times, a nation does not break first because of its enemies on the outside. It breaks when its leaders stop listening. It breaks when pride takes the place of wisdom. It breaks when power forgets that it was given in order to serve. Rehoboam wanted to prove his strength, but he ended up losing the very thing he needed most to protect, the unity of the people. When the northern tribes rejected the authority of the house of David, the kingdom did not divide at random. The northern tribes were the majority. 10 tribes represented a large part of the ancient people who descended from Jacob, the man God had named Israel. So when they formed a separate kingdom, they kept that name, Israel. Not because they were more spiritual, not because Jerusalem was with them, not because the temple was in their territory, but because they represented most of the tribes of ancient Israel. But in the south, another kingdom remained. There was the tribe of Judah, one of the strongest and most important tribes. There was also Benjamin. There were many Levites connected to the service of the temple, and there were Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David. That is why the southern kingdom became known as Judah, and this is where the great tension of the story appears. Israel had most of the tribes, but Judah had Jerusalem. Israel had more territory and more people, but Judah had the temple, the throne of David, and the royal line through which the messianic promise would come. That is why this division was so deep. It was not just a map split in two. It was a wound in the identity of the people. The north could say, "We are Israel," but the south could say, "We still have Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David." And from that moment on, the Bible begins to speak of two kingdoms where there had once been only one origin, one promise. But now, two separate paths. And over the northern kingdom, a new leader would rise. His name was Jeroboam. Jeroboam was not a descendant of David, but he was not an unknown man either. He had been an important figure during the reign of Solomon. He was capable. He was strategic. He was a leader from the north who had worked within the kingdom. But one day the prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam and announced that God would give him 10 tribes of the kingdom. From that moment on, Jeroboam's name became tied to the division that was coming. When Solomon heard about this, he wanted to kill him. So Jeroboam fled to Egypt. But when Solomon died, Jeroboam returned, and the people of the north placed him at the front of the rebellion against Rehoboam. He would not only lead a political separation, he would also open one of the deepest spiritual wounds in the history of Israel. Jeroboam became king of the north. Now he ruled over the kingdom that kept the name Israel, but he had a problem. Even though the northern tribes no longer obeyed the house of David, Jerusalem was still the center of worship for the covenant people. The temple did not lose its spiritual weight just because the map had been divided. So for Jeroboam, every trip the people made to Jerusalem became a threat. Because he thought that if the people kept going back to Jerusalem, their hearts might also return to the house of David. They might remember the temple. They might remember the holy city. They might remember the throne God had established in Judah. And because he was afraid of losing control, Jeroboam made a terrible decision. Instead of trusting God, he decided to create a religious solution to protect his political power. He set up 2 centers of worship, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and there he placed golden calves. Then he told the people they no longer needed to go up to Jerusalem. In other words, Jeroboam offered them a more convenient faith, a closer place of worship, an easier path. But it was not obedience, it was convenience. And that is when the division became even more serious. Because at first, the kingdom had been divided by a crisis of leadership. But now, the heart of the people was being led toward corrupted worship. Jeroboam did not only separate a territory, he also tried to separate the people from the place where God had placed his name. He did not only build a throne in the north, he built altars to protect that throne, and that became one of the deepest mistakes of his reign. Because when a leader is afraid of losing power, he may even use sacred things to control people. And so, Northern Israel did not only begin walking down a different political road, it began walking down a dangerous spiritual road. The kingdom that kept the name Israel began to drift away from the heart of true worship. And while Judah kept Jerusalem and the temple, Israel began building a separate identity around altars God had never commanded. The wound was no longer only on the map, it was on the altar. And when a division reaches the altar, it does not only affect governments, it affects generations. From that day on, Israel and Judah walked separate paths. They never became the united kingdom they had once been under David and Solomon. In the north was Israel, identified with the 10 tribes, with more territory and with its own kings. In the south was Judah, with Jerusalem, the temple, and the house of David. But the division did not bring peace. Over time, both kingdoms experienced tension, conflict, wrong alliances, and seasons of deep disobedience. Israel, the northern kingdom, drifted farther and farther away from the ways of God. The golden calves Jeroboam had set up in Bethel and Dan were not a small mistake. They were the beginning of a dangerous path. One generation learned to worship in a distorted way. Then another generation grew up thinking it was normal. And little by little, what began as a political decision became a sick spiritual culture. But Judah was not untouched either. Even though Judah had Jerusalem, even though Judah had the temple, even though Judah preserved the house of David, Judah also fell many times into idolatry, injustice, and hardness of heart. God spoke to both kingdoms through the prophets. He called, he warned, he waited for repentance. But the people did not return with all their hearts. Eventually, Israel fell first. Assyria conquered Samaria, and the northern kingdom disappeared as an independent kingdom. Then Judah fell. Babylon came against Jerusalem. The city was taken, the temple was destroyed, and many were carried away into exile. First, Israel fell. Then, Judah fell. And when we look at the whole story, we begin to understand something painful. The problem was not only that the kingdom had been divided in two, the heart of the people was divided too, divided between God and idols, divided between obedience and convenience, divided between the promise of the Lord and the desire to be like the nations around them. And yet, God did not abandon his purpose. Even though the kingdom was broken, the promise did not die. Even though the people were scattered, God continued to speak of restoration. Even though the house of David seemed weakened, God continued to preserve the hope of a righteous king. The prophet spoke of a day when God would gather his people again, a day when he would heal the division, a day when he would raise up a true shepherd, because the faithfulness of God was greater than the unfaithfulness of his people. Israel and Judah never came back together as the old kingdom of David. But the story did not end with division. It did not end with collapse. It did not end with exile. The story was still pointing to something greater, to a restoration no human king could produce on his own, to a kingdom that would not depend on the pride of men, to a promise that God himself would fulfill in his time. Because when people break what God entrusted to them, God can still preserve what he promised. And that is the great hope in the middle of this story. Even though the kingdom was broken, the promise did not die. But this story does not only explain why Israel and Judah ended up as two separate kingdoms, it also confronts us, because before the kingdom was divided on the map, something was already breaking in the heart. Rehoboam did not lose 10 tribes only because of one bad answer. He lost them because he did not know how to listen. He had wise counsel in front of him. He had an opportunity to serve. He had a moment to heal an old burden. But he chose the voice that fed his pride. And maybe that is where this story begins to speak to us, because many times God speaks before something breaks. He corrects us. He warns us. He surrounds us with people who tell us the truth. He shows us that one decision can either unite or destroy. But when pride becomes heavier than obedience, we can end up defending our position while losing what God had entrusted to us. And then there is Jeroboam. He did not act from trust. He acted from fear. He was afraid of losing control. So he built a more convenient kind of worship, an easier faith, a path that seemed practical, but pulled the people away from the center of God's presence. And that can happen in the heart too. Sometimes we do not say we have left God, but we begin to negotiate with obedience. We trade conviction for comfort. We trade the altar for routine. We trade dependence for control. And without even realizing it, we begin to build small altars where God is no longer first. That is why this story is not only an ancient lesson, it is a living warning. A divided kingdom shows us how dangerous a divided heart can be. A heart that wants God, but also wants to stay in control. A heart that listens to the word, but only obeys when it does not cost too much. A heart that prays, while still building its own ways to avoid full surrender. And yet, there is hope. Because even though Israel was divided, God did not stop calling. Even though Judah fell, God did not stop speaking. Even though the people failed, the promise still stood. That means your cracks are not stronger than the mercy of God. Your mistakes are not greater than His faithfulness. And if today you recognize that there are divided places in your life, God is not calling you to destroy you. He is calling you back to surrender, back to obedience, back to a heart made whole in Him. Because true restoration begins when we stop fighting for control and return to the center of His will. If this story helped you understand why Israel was divided into two kingdoms and why the Bible speaks of Israel and Judah as two different paths, I want to invite you to do something simple but meaningful. Write in the comments, "Lord, unite my heart with your will." Because this story is not only about an ancient kingdom, it also reminds us that God desires to heal every divided heart, every broken place, and every part of our lives that needs to return to Him. If this video blessed your life, share it with someone who loves learning from the Bible, or with someone who needs to remember that God's faithfulness still stands, even when we fail. I also invite you to subscribe to Bible Revelations and turn on the notification bell, because here we continue walking through the stories, the people, and the deep truths of God's Word. And don't leave just yet. Watch the other videos on the channel so you can keep discovering how God works, even in the middle of difficult decisions, human failures, and promises that seem impossible. May the Lord bless your life, strengthen your faith, and unite your heart more and more each day with His perfect will. Until next time, may the peace and light of God be with you always,